Welcome back to another fabulous episode of Acceptable Chess. Once again, I am your host, John Harden, here with National Master Andrew Hoy. And tonight, Andrew is going to share with us his inner workings of his opening preparation. It's not creepy and it's not weird, actually, at all. But, it's fun to suggest as much. Andrew, what opening are we going to be looking at?
Yeah, so we are going to start off by looking at the Panov attack in the Caro Kann. We're going to be looking from the white side. This works out well because both John and I play the Panov with white. And I think the Caro Kann is one of the 5 major black openings that you'll really run into when you play e4 on move 1.
Can confirm. I feel like I have a decent record against this opening, probably because of getting a fair amount of help in preparing it from you over the years. But yeah, nonetheless, it is definitely a solid and very popular choice. So it makes sense as one to look at.
Yeah, now I have to admit, I also play this with black, so I'm a little bit concerned to be showing how to play against the opening that I choose to play, but one thing at a time. I think this will be fun.
Yeah, we'll look at the Nimzo Larson another evening, Ty. Just any day now, we're going to get to that.
All right, so the Panov starts off with the normal Caro Kann, and then white trades on d5 and plays c4. So by playing this way, white is willing to take on an isolated queen pawn, also referred to as an IQP or an Isolani, and in exchange, white is going to get some quick development, and we're going to have things like knight c3, knight f3, bishop c4. The bishop usually develops quickly, and we get a chance to develop very quickly and really strike back in the center with white, even though we are taking on some long-term weaknesses.
I want to emphasize, just for the chat, make sure that is IQP. It is not ICP, Insane Clown Posse. That is a band that Andrew was really into in middle school. Continue on.
No, I think that's the most important things. Anything I missed? Anything else you want to share about the Panov? Your favorite things? Anything you like in particular?
I like that when I get to play this opening, I almost always get an attacking game. It is definitely, I think, even in the most solid positions from black, I usually get some opportunities to play some active fighting chess, and that always makes me really happy. So for that reason, I'm usually pretty psyched to see the Caro Kann played.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that my record is, outside of the norm. I actually don't know what it is. I feel like it's pretty good, based purely on what I can remember. I feel like I have good results, but it's more just that I get positions that I'm happy with and, enjoy playing.
Yeah, I think that's the most important thing, to be honest.
Yeah.
All right, well, let's take a look at the first couple of moves, and then we'll talk about the major forks. So I play the Caro Kann as black from time to time. I certainly play the Panov as white. So we have some level of familiarity with the opening already going into it. So we're going to be working at a fairly high level with this prep session, but I'll show basically what I do in order to prepare, and then we'll try and remember some of it. I have a pretty good memory. I've lucked out that way, but I do think it's useful to look at it pretty frequently as well.
I have an exceptional memory as long as it's lines of Shakespeare. Strangely, when it is lines of chess, it is not always quite as effective.
All right, so we'll think about lines of Shakespeare and sonnets that we can use to help work as memory tricks.
Yeah, the Caro Kann is like King Lear. I'll figure out a justification for that sentence before the end of the stream.
There you go. All right. So we're going to start with the knight f6 lines. Certainly black can play e6 as well, but because they transpose and I'm trying to keep my files as tight as possible, we'll look at knight f6 in the move order. I think this is a good chance to say, because we haven't done a stream like this, there are a lot of different move order tricks, and I try and annotate my files with the correct move order tricks so that I can find the main lines of my analysis. I also make very heavy use of exclamation marks and question marks as I'm going through files, and those are more like breadcrumbs to find my way back to a position, because I kind of split up analysis into two things. It's the initial decision what I want to play, and then I go back over it later in order to really commit it to memory and understand it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
All right, so we have now reached the first place where we're going to branch, and I'll pull up the opening explorer as well as the engine just so that you guys can see it. And the first branch is whether black plays knight c6 or e6. We're going to skip g6 for the time being because I think those structures are very different, but I think that looking at the g6 lines is really important. Let's very quickly talk about knight c6 just for completion. I want to start with e6 actually tonight, but there are two ways to play here. You can either play knight f3 and allow this pin, which is a little bit annoying, but white actually can go into an endgame line, which is a little tiny pull for white, and I think you're playing for two results there. Or, John, I know you play this bishop g5 move, which is very strong, and I think this avoids some of that endgame shenanigans, and you can just play a game that you're comfortable with.
Yeah, I would say that the merit of your style with knight to f3 is that you can get a pretty safe and secure small advantage, as you said. And I think at the depth of theory that you understand and have memorized, you've shown me that line a couple of times. We'll see if we can get there at some point this evening. But you are pretty well guaranteed to get a position that you're more familiar with than your opponent. For me, I mean, I think I'm capable of memorizing that line, but I've always liked the opportunity to just keep pieces on. And a lot of the time against lower rated players in particular, I find that gives me more opportunity not only to win, but sometimes to win in under 40 moves, which I admit makes me really happy. Because especially in the tournament's milestone Sundays that I've been playing lately, my one chance to play over the board, I've often got another game coming. And so it's pretty nice when you can wrap it up against a lower rated player and get yourself a break. Makes a big difference in your results down the line.
Yeah, I agree with that.
But right, both lines clearly valid.
Yeah, let's hop back to the e6 line though. So let's look at this. And I think that the best way for white to play is to play knight f3 here. So we're going to skip any sort of captures on d5 or c5 pushes and just go for knight f3. Now there are two lines that I want to really focus on. That's bishop e7 and bishop b4. One thing that I do want to mention explicitly right here in this position, black can already go wrong with knight c6. After knight c6, you'll see that the engine is immediately pointing out that white can play c5, and I think c5 is very strong here. And this is partially because black doesn't have the same b6 breaks that he usually has in some of these c5 lines, because white can play bishop b5, immediately pinning the knight, and you kind of get to this really nice structure where the knight comes to e5, and now white can play b4, a3, bishop f4, and develop very naturally with a nice space advantage.
Okay, so hang on a second, because I do think that those concrete lines that you're pointing out are actually reasonably clear, but this c5 move seems to be killing all of the tension in the center and kind of is the kind of overextending move that we usually tell players to completely avoid. So, WTF?
Yeah, I think that this is a move that I would want to avoid. It does remove the tension. However, because of the move order that black has picked, because this knight has come to c6 right away, we can concretely take advantage of the fact that we're going to be able to play bishop b5 and trade off our bishop for the knight. That gives us control of this e5 square with both the knight and the bishop, and it becomes very hard for black to fight back against that. But I totally agree that c5 is not a move that you usually want to play. I'm truly just mentioning this for completion in this case. I would strongly recommend not playing c5.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I mean, I know what I thought you were going to say, which I'm going to now say, is that also this c5 move is not without merit, because there is an idea also of being able to create a 3-on-2, right? I mean, as soon as this move is played of c5, there are possibilities of playing exactly. Thank you. These arrows are so.
We have a lot of colors, but
yeah. Give them the orange, but don't tell them how to do it. Yeah. So this is sort of actually pretty reasonable, and can be quite scary. I've won some nice games in some of these positions, even against higher rated players. I think partially because they underestimate such a weird looking move.
Yeah, that's fair. I think it's double edged. It's a lot to think about, but you're right. I think that there is a good opportunity to learn something concrete, even though this is going to be the exception that proves the rule.
Yeah, quite right.
All right, so let's hop back to the main line. I do think that it's important to talk about these variations, but we want to focus on the main line as much as possible when we're starting out with an opening. Then you can go back, and once you've understood the main line, then you can fill in around it.
Yeah, I've noticed that a lot of openings books and things often actually start by looking at the sidelines. And I get the appeal of wanting to show people how to just crush with the opening, that like, oh, here's black not playing very well or something like that. But it seems like a bad way to start. And it's always kind of frustrated me that it's very frequently not what I'm playing.
Yeah, and I think that because of the way I try and prepare, I try and do it in the most practical way possible. I think that starting with the main line is the best way to do it. Then, when you're over the board, you can figure out why the move that was played by your opponent, which is not the move that you've prepared for, is less good, and you can try and understand how to play.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
All right. So again, the two moves that we really want to focus on are either bishop e7 or bishop b4. So let's start with bishop e7 because again, I think that's more common. So now we don't want to lose a tempo as white by moving this bishop. If we play a move like bishop e2, black can take on c4 and black has gained a tempo. So for that reason, instead of doing anything like that, we'll take on d5. I'm going to skip e takes d5 for the time being. This is a symmetrical pawn structure. White has an extra move. White has not committed the bishop to e2, where it really doesn't have any scope. So white has a clear but persistent edge. It's not very much. Like you can see that the engine is saying plus 0.1, but already we can play moves like bishop d3, we can castle, we can play h3 to stop the bishop from coming to its natural g4 square. Again, I cannot draw lines. And we'll probably play bishop g5 to put some pressure on this knight. So long story short, even though it's not a huge edge, I do think it's a clear edge for white.
Can I ask a question there just from my own experience?
Sure.
I think that makes perfect sense, and I want to say, yeah, explicitly that it doesn't make a lot of sense for black to take here because, of course, this idea of playing for the end game with the isolated queen's pawn being a weakness is one of his major plans, and he completely takes that away. This pawn is no longer exposed. But you mentioned that we could play something like bishop d3 and eventually h3 to stop bishop g4. I suppose probably I need to castle first, but if you then castle, I actually find these positions a lot of the time really annoying. Granted, in blitz, but I'm just sort of interested in what you would do to deal with this here.
Yeah, here because the knight has not come to c6, so it's not putting any pressure on d4, I would play h3 right away. And if bishop h5, I would seriously consider playing this structure after bishop g4 and taking. I think that the fact that I'm getting the e5 square for all eternity, the fact that my queen can come to the light squares, white will still have some excellent light square control that black doesn't have, and I think that it's going to be an easier game for white to play.
That's really interesting. I think that I'm really skittish about ever pushing the bishop back that way because of what it does to my king side. So
sure. If you're worried about it, you can play h3 in this position as well before you castle.
Right, of course. Yeah.
Actually, you'll see that is, in fact, the main move.
Yeah. No, but that's intriguing, just as an alternative way of doing it. I mean, both as a different avenue to explore, but also as a, we're talking about a blitz context here. Sometimes I just forget.
Yeah.
Sometimes I don't put that h-pawn where it should go.
Alrighty, so getting back to the main line, after knight d5, I think we want to play bishop d3. You can see that there are several moves that are all reasonably popular. Bishop d3 by far the most popular, though. So we'll just consider bishop d3 for the time being. And now black is going to play knight c6 and castles on his next two moves. I don't really think there's a large difference between the two. There are technically some lines that can be achieved by castling first. If I remove this, you can actually see this file. I have a bunch of things in here. Let me see if I can find it. There we go. So what I tend to do is, because the main move is knight c6, if black castles here, I'm going to show lines where black does not play knight c6. And this is, again, just a trick that I use in my own PGN files so that I can find the lines that I'm trying to get to later.
Kulma had a question in the chat, why b5 was so draw-ish.
b5? Where did I write that in a comment somewhere?
I'm not sure. Oh, bishop b5. Why is bishop b5 so drawish?
Oh, yeah, I think that if the trades are going to happen, it's a little bit hard for white to win, especially because in this type of position, we don't want to trade off minor pieces. So really, white wants to keep all the minor pieces on the board and go for an attack. We want to be able to make use of the e5 square. We might want to pin the knight if we can get something concrete, but we don't want to do that right here, because if we are playing bishop b5, black is going to immediately play bishop d7, and we're already about to trade off a pair of minor pieces.
Yeah.
Again, the rule of thumb, when you have an isolated queen pawn, you want to keep the minor pieces on the board.
Yeah, play for the attack. Don't let yourself get into a situation where the two rooks and the queen are all tripled on the d file, mounting up against your d pawn, and you have nothing to do but grovel for a draw.
Exactly. All right, so we have gotten to this position after both sides have castled, and now white wants to wait and see what black is going to do. Black has a couple of ways to deploy the pieces, so we want to start with rook e1. So, Richie, good question. I think that it's hard to memorize lines. We kind of split this up into two parts. There's the initial part where we go through and decide what we're going to play, and then we later try and commit it to memory. The only good way to commit lines to memory is to play it. When I first learned the endgame line, I only learned it because I played a 40-game match with my coach, Mark Esserman, in 2014. And I took the black side of that, and I lost probably 39 of those 40 games. And then the very next day, I went and had the white side of that against an IM and won handily. So it's kind of interesting, but you really have to play something in order to commit it to memory. There's no replacement for sitting at a board and spending 3 hours in one position to make it really sink in.
Yeah, I think the point that you did not quite make there, too, is the idea that when you screw it up, I mean, it's always a bummer if the game matters. And obviously, it was amazing that you were able to take down that IM. That was a definitely a highlight of your career from what I've seen. And I've watched a lot of your games. But the way that you are motivated to improve when you forget that key opening move, you know, that time that you blow it, the next game out, you are 100% certain as to what the right move is because of how much it cost you.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I do think that Chessable has a very important part to memorizing openings, but I think that Chessable works better if you're trying to keep an opening fresh. If you're learning it initially, Chessable can be a little bit hard because it throws so much at you initially. And I think some of what we're going to work through tonight, as a matter of fact, is a little bit more useful up front. And the books that Chessable has do more of this. It's working through a bunch of games in the selected opening so that you can see how top players play through the lines that you're recommending. Yeah, Mr. Pickles, that game was particularly noteworthy because I think I was about 2100 at the time, and I ended up winning a really nice game, and it was probably one of the cleanest games I had played to date.
I don't actually. Kind of fun. Yeah, you've taken down a GM. I don't remember this.
Oh, several. It's it happens.
Fair enough.
from time to
Fair
time.
enough. I guess I don't get every email.
I think I showed you the Ivanov game, so it's you can look at that
enough.
later.
Yeah, fair enough.
All right. So back to this line, rook e1 is a waiting move. We don't want to play bishop g5 because that would hang a piece. We don't want to play bishop d2 or bishop e3. So rook e1, just a useful waiting move. And here there are probably 4 moves that I want to look at, 2 of which we can dispense with pretty quickly. There's knight takes c3. Obviously, we're going to take back. There is... knight f6, which is somewhat normal. The idea is that black does not want to allow white to trade, and instead black is going to try and control this e4 square with the knight. There's bishop f6. We're immediately putting some pressure on d4 so that we don't have to worry so much about white's threats. We're not quite threatening to take yet, but we're very close to threatening to take on d4. If, for example, if we were able to get king h8 in like this, now we're threatening to take on d4 because we have 2 attackers and only 1 defender.
Right. And there is no longer some discovered attack idea of taking on h7 and eating a whole queen.
Exactly, yes.
Right.
And then the other moves that I want to talk about is b6. So again, we're kind of skipping knight takes c3 because it's letting white bring an extra piece to the center, and we'll probably talk about those positions later. But let's start with b6. So after b6, white can take on d5, which I think is a reasonable approach. And the reason we would take on d5 is because we're immediately getting the e4 square with tempo. So by chasing the queen away, the queen generally goes back to d6. Now we're prepared to play d5. And we don't want to play it just yet. We want to start with knight e5. And again, we're noticing that we're not hanging d4 because of this pin. Here, obviously the best move is to take on c6, but even here, we're winning an entire rook. So this is quite okay for white. All right.
Yeah,
so,
I like white's chances.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's good enough to say about this. After bishop e4, you can look at the engine evaluation. If the engine is saying +1.5, you have to have the confidence that you can convert this over the board. But I think that this is a very nice position to play for white. So I don't want to waste my memorization power on this position. I want to just say, good enough, I'll be able to win, and I'm going to focus on other things that are more likely to happen.
That makes a lot of sense. I will admit that I often spend time in these positions memorizing just a little bit more because I get so powerfully enraged when I don't win them that sometimes I end up going back and saying, okay, another 4 or 5 moves, that'll do it.
Yeah, and you know what? I don't think that's a bad approach if you are, in fact, losing a blitz game in this position. If you play a blitz game, get this position, and it doesn't work out, then it's worth going back and learning a bit more.
Yeah, as we said earlier, now you have that emotional motivation that I think does aid the memory quite a bit.
Yeah, yep. All right, so one thing that I want to take note of, bishop d7 is not a move in this file, so we haven't really looked at this in this position yet, but the engine is saying bishop d7 is the best move. And now if we scroll down here, we'll see that bishop d7 has only been played 18 times. The reason that it's not in the file and that it's only been played 18 times is because you generally have to transpose back to something with a piece coming to f6. So just for completion, we'll put it on the board. We can see that we can immediately take on d5 and get this nice looking position. We can now play things like bishop f4 in order to take over the e5 square. But it's still always interesting to make note of the fact that this move is not something that's common and the engine likes it. So this is a potential for novelty for black, and it's something that you would want to file away. All right, so let's look at bishop f6. I think I consider bishop f6 to be the main line, but it's probably pretty close between the two. Did we want to look at one more thing before we get there? No, we'll look at that when we come to knight f6.
Using the royal we here is Andrew.
Yeah, exactly. All right, so after bishop f6, there are 2 moves that you can play here. There's either knight e4 or bishop e4. Knight e4 does gambit a pawn, so we're giving away this d4 pawn. It's a little bit double-edged. I have played this position before. We can actually see if my game is showing up on Lichess. I think I played this against Epiphany at one point. Nope, too many 2500s for my game to show up in the top 4. But I think that this is actually an interesting position because we're willing to give up this pawn in order to get the bishop pair and a nice long-term position. There are some sharp lines where d4 can hang, so black does have to be a little bit careful. But I don't want to spend too much time on this. I want to focus on the lines that we're most likely to play. All right, so the most common move, we'll switch back to the Masters game, is bishop e4. Why do we play bishop e4? Well, black is not controlling the e4 square with a knight. Again, arrows. So this gives us a chance to occupy the center with a piece, and now we're defending this pawn with 2 pieces. We never have to worry about knight takes c3. That just lets an extra pawn come to the center. This bishop looks really silly on f6 if we do get this pawn on c3, and you can see that the engine already really likes white's position. All right, so the 2 main moves here are going to be knight to e7, and I guess it's really only knight to e7. The queen c7 stuff really has to happen after knight e7. So black will almost certainly play knight c to e7. All right, in this position, we now notice that we have not covered the e5 square, so white is immediately going to hop in and occupy the e5 square. Again, we don't have to worry about this capture. Even though the queens can come off and the structure is shattered, I would say that we can compare these bishops and conclude that white has a nice advantage.
Yeah, makes sense. That's interesting. I think the thing that's overwhelmingly coming across to me looking at you going through this is how much better you evaluate certain positions. I don't just mean that you do it better than I do, but also that there are a number of positions in here that I am surprised to hear you express such optimism about. And I think that's really educational for me.
Yeah. I think it's interesting that you mentioned that because it's something that I've put a lot of time into. I play the Panov for both colors, so I've studied a lot of these games already. And Richie, that's a really good question. Why not a3? A3 is a common move here. I don't think we need to play a3. A3, the idea is to keep a knight out of b4. Generally, it's going to be this knight on c6. And we'll actually see that we play a3 in some of the lines with knight f6. And the reason we do that is we don't want black to be able to get to this structure where this knight comes to d5. Now you'll see that a3 is the main move. And again, we're just trying to stop this idea. I don't think we need to spend the tempo after bishop f6, but it is interesting that it scores the highest on the percentage. Although the engine, and again, I don't know how much engine you can really put into the engine evaluations in the opening, but I think that bishop e4 is the most common move, and we're going to see most of the games that we want to study are starting with bishop e4. All right, so let's get to a position that we like as a starting point. After knight e5, the most common thing to play is bishop d7. White could potentially take on d7. I think this is already a mistake. I think that we're giving black way too much control of d5, and we have traded off our very best piece, the knight on e5. You're welcome. Yeah, happy to. So in this position, yeah, we can play queen d3. This is a pretty typical idea, but I don't think that we're really getting any sort of real attack without the knight on e5. We really need that knight in order to weaken up this structure. We might play h4, h5, but no matter how we're doing it, we need that one extra piece contributing to the attack. All right, so let's go back. And after bishop d7, I don't know if you can see this super clearly. There we go. So you can see that I have queen d3 annotated with an exclamation mark. That's because I've looked at this in the past and I have decided that queen d3 is the best move, and I didn't want to have to spend a lot of time here in the future when I'm going through remembering games, remembering the move that I want to play. So this comes from a lot of trial and error. I've experimented with this position, but I've finally decided that queen d3 is the move I want to play. Why do I want to play queen d3? It lifts the queen. I get chances to play queen g3 or queen h3 with a very quick attack. I am defending my bishop on e4. Not that I really have to worry about it just yet. And the fact that this h7 pawn is targeted, if black plays some sort of pass move, I get to immediately capture on h7, and there's a very, very quick mating pattern that you have to worry about. All right.
Yeah, ow.
Yeah, ow indeed. One other thing that I want to point out is h6 in this position after queen d3 is not really ideal. And that's because we have made this light square diagonal very weak. So I get a chance to play moves like queen f3, bishop c2, and queen e4, even though that takes a really long time, and I'll have ideas of checkmating on h7. Yeah, Richie, that's exactly the move that I want to play here, queen g3. So I'm immediately threatening to take on h6. I'm preparing that rearrangement that I just mentioned, and there's really no great way for black to exploit the position of the queen on g3. So nice catch, and I think that this is a useful position to bear in mind. Even though the evaluation is pretty close to even after bishop c6, I think that this is already much easier to play for white. We can either take on h6 or take on c6 here. I don't like taking on h6. I think that this allows a little bit too much for white. We trade off just a few too many pieces, but I think that it's reasonable to take on c6 here, and after we take on c6, now we can take on h6, and you'll see that white is up a clean pawn. We have some long-term pressure on g7, and it's very hard for black to defend that. We're going to be able to play moves like rook e3 to g3, bishop d3, or bishop c2, and black kind of has to sit there and take it. There's not a way for black to fight back in the center right away.
The one thing I want to throw in there is that I so often see, even players, I've had games against 2100 sometimes, who don't see the harm in throwing in the move like h6. That they think, well, there's all these threats on taking on h7, and I'm just going to throw this in here, and I won't have to worry about it the rest of the game. Or lower down the rating level, you'll hear the same exact move justified with, well, I'm making lift for my king, right? I don't have to worry about getting back ranked for the rest of the game. And I think it's always worth noting just how fast and how with accurate play, how quickly you can come to a very deadly attack, exploiting that weakness. The end game never comes.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think that it's if you're going to play the Panov, you must be prepared to play an attacking game.
Yeah.
All right, so let's hop back to the main line. Let's look at the database first. There are 3 moves here. G6, far and away the most popular, the best score for black, although you'll see it's mostly draws. H6, 9 games, and white has done very well, and knight G6. So we should consider knight G6. You'll see that's not in my file. And after knight G6, I think that the move that I've thought about in the past is, I remember that I was going to take on D7 and figure it out from there. And the reason why is I can force black to cover up my Isolani. I still have the bishop pair. I get a tempo on the queen, and I think that the position is probably closer to equal than a real edge for white, but I'm happy to play an equal position if I don't have a long-term weakness that I have to worry about. I have something concrete in the bishop pair, and I have the e-file already. I have better development, and I think that those factors contribute to say that I would have good practical chances in this position.
Yeah, it's probably not simple enough to go so far as to say you're playing for 2 results, but without that endgame weakness, it definitely seems like white has a really safe way to play for a win.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Richie, do you mean knight c3 here? Here, I think it's very bad because we can just go for mate. We don't actually have to take the knight back. There is another opportunity to play knight c3, but this certainly isn't it because we don't have to recapture. Yeah, and I think this is an important reason to analyze with the engine on when you're looking at the opening. You should be able to quickly look and see that knight c3 is going to hang a mate. And when you're looking at openings, especially when you're looking at GM games, you sometimes give too much faith to the moves they play and miss some of these huge blunders.
Yeah, it's so incredibly easy. And frankly, with pre-move, even easier online to just take that knight back and miss this opportunity.
Yeah, that's a really good point. All right, so we're starting to see with very few moves, we should probably start looking at some games. So we see that there's this game Ivanchuk Karpov from 92. Let's take a look at it. That's one of the earliest games you'll see, and you want to really understand the genesis of a position like this. So after queen d3, Karpov played knight g6. So here we were thinking we might want to take on d7 and take on d5 and play bishop f5. However, it looks like Ivanchuk actually played bishop d2. So Ivanchuk wanted to keep all of the pieces on the board. Now, he goes on to win with only 2 inaccuracies, but this is one of the inaccuracies, so that's a little bit funny. All right, so now all I want to do is go through the game relatively quickly and identify any key themes or moves that Ivanchuk plays. Again, because we're looking at this from the white side, we're looking for white wins. So I haven't seen this game, so this is going to be new to me. My gut reaction is I might want to play for knight c5, but I really can't because d4 would be hanging. So Ivanchuk takes and plays bishop e3, which makes a lot of sense. He's trying to get this d5 break in. He's willing to give up the b2 pawn because we really can't afford to take that. The queen runs out of squares. The queen cannot come out to a3. The queen can't back up along the file, so this would trap the whole queen. All right, so again, we're just going to look at it quickly. Now we take, I'm not entirely sure that this is good, but we're surviving because if we play something like this, there's this nice shot rook d4, and rook d4 is going to allow the queen to escape. All right, so, oh, this is what happened. Oh, this is really funny. Okay, so the queen escapes, and we get to this opposite bishop position. And actually, it looks like we're just going to get, unless black takes on a1, we're going to get an exchange up for white. Now, black does have the 2 pawns for it, but this looks like it should be a nice endgame for white to play. All right, so notice that we cannot take because we would be hanging this exchange on a1, and that would be really bad. So we'll just go through the next couple of moves. We've untangled a little bit. And now white is willing to trade queens. And for some reason, Karpov trades queens, and I think that already we have a very difficult endgame to hold for black. The engine still says roughly equal, but whenever you have a rook against a knight, I think that the rook gets a large advantage in an endgame, and already we have an endgame where the rook can develop to b7. In fact, that is what Ivanchuk played, and I think that this is going to be a pretty straightforward way for white to play. White's moves come very naturally, and black already has to find ways to keep the position closed. So again, because this isn't really part of our opening prep, I want to go through this pretty quickly. All right, so black has gotten to the ideal endgame with this bishop against a rook. However, I think that the fact that the king is more developed means that white is the only one playing for an advantage. All right, and this does look somewhat close to equal. It's a little bit better for white, but probably not so much. But it looks like Karpov makes this horrific blunder, and he hangs a whole piece and immediately resigns.
Oof. I was thinking just a moment ago about the opportunity to perhaps exploit the pin on the c-pawn. And wow, that's not a thing you expect a GM to do.
I think if king d6 had been played instead, Ivanchuk probably would have played for g4 at some moment and just gone after some of these weaknesses. But again, it's hard to win, and chess is hard to win if your opponent is playing well. All right, so I think that's enough of that game. And again, we've decided that if they play knight g6, we're going to take on d7 and ignore the line that Ivanchuk actually played with bishop d2.
We don't need him.
Yeah, exactly. So after h6, my notes say h4 is a novelty, and this was probably a pretty rare move. Maybe it had been played already. It looks like it has been played as early as 82, so it's not truly a novelty. But because it's not something that's commonly played at the top level, the most common moves are bishop h6 or bishop takes d5. I have it notated as a novelty because it's probably not something my opponents have prepared for. All right, so h4, the idea is to play h5 and take on g6 and go for that attack. And I think that it's very bad for black to take on h4. If we turn the engine on, you'll see that we have some very nice ideas with the queen h3. I think that the move order is important, so that's why I have two moves here. I think you can kind of see it a little bit. I can actually turn off the annotation, but I have both bishop h6 and queen f3 here. The idea of queen f3, of course, is to put pressure on f7, and we want to play bishop h6 first in order to chase this rook away from f7. Again, this is a very concrete position, but I finally decided that after queen h3, I think this is a very nice edge for white. We have excellent dark square control. We are threatening tricks on the light squares depending on what black plays. For example, if we have bishop f6, we can take on d5, and then we can play for this knight g4 idea. So I think that the most correct way to do this is to take, and then black cannot take back on d5 because we would hang d7. So for example, if we take here, I think that we can take with the queen or the knight. Yeah, it looks like both moves are fine. So black must take on e5. And now you'll see that we are really getting to our nice bishop against a bad bishop. Black has to play rook b8, and now we can take. And with this dark square bishop, we just have a massive amount of control on the dark squares, and black is going to have a very difficult time defending this attack.
Yeah, that looks nasty.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I think that's very close to winning for white. So for that reason, I don't think taking on h4 is good. I think it's probably far more common that we'll get something else like bishop c6 or knight takes c3. But I think that this is a reasonable place to stop in this line for now. We have an opening surprise with h4. We know that the ideas are to push h5. For example, if knight c3, of course we're going to take back with the b pawn and reinforce our center. We don't really have to worry about taking on e5 because now we get this very nice position after we keep the queens on, of course, with a dark square bishop against a fianchetto without a dark square bishop. I would almost evaluate this position as winning because this dark square bishop is going to be worth more than a rook. If we get something else, if we get a move like, backing up a little ways, h5, if I can play the correct move, now black has made another weakness and g6 is going to be a target. We have to be a little bit careful attacking g6. It would be premature to take now. I think that there are too many defensive ideas with this bishop. For example, probably queen f6 is the cleanest. But that threat is always going to be present. So instead we can play bishop h6, develop with tempo. If rook e8, well, now we can start to think about moves like queen f3 attacking two pieces. And this is already a little bit dangerous for black because we're threatening to take twice on d5 and then take on f7 or f6. So another line that might be considered is bishop g7. And if bishop g7, we could probably take, but I'd rather play bishop g5. And we have to see that f6 doesn't work out because we can take on d7. Now taking on g5 would be a large mistake because we can win material by taking on f8. So if black takes, now we can retreat the bishop, and we have succeeded in weakening the structure. Probably this is a terminal weakness for black, and it's going to be too hard to hold, at least practically speaking.
Yeah, that crucial detail of not needing to immediately cash in for it to be worthwhile. I think I've experienced the losing side of that exact idea a lot of times, right? Thinking, oh, that I was able to push off and calculate something where they weren't immediately able to break through, and then the more experienced player just withdraws, and I suddenly realize what I've done to my position.
Yeah, definitely. Especially because in this position, G6 is hanging and it's very hard to defend. Like, this is the only move that looks reasonable to defend it, and we can already take back here. And if we take back with the pawn, I'm extremely happy with this position for white. I no longer have a weak isolated pawn. The bishop on G7 is ridiculous. I have the bishop pair. I would be happy to play this for 100 moves and eventually win.
Yeah. Yeah, just play to exhaust your opponent's ability to defend.
Yeah, exactly. So again, I think that until we get this in a game and find that we've forgotten something or done something wrong, this is good enough. I don't want to spend too much time on this position just yet, especially because h4 is not something that the opponent has probably prepared for. The most common move is bishop h6, which is something that we probably would have to know about. And going for this exchange and only now playing h4 is very different because we've traded off our best attacking piece. All right. So let's jump back to what happens after knight f6 instead of bishop to f6. Now we have two main moves. There's either bishop g5 or a3. a3 is the most common. I would prefer to play bishop g5 personally. This is a move that has been shown to me by a lot of strong players, and it's just one that I've filed away for future use. I think that it's better to develop, if we can. The bishop's natural square is g5, so we might as well put it there. And black could certainly go right back, but now I'm happy to play a move like bishop d2 and be up a free tempo. I've gotten in this bishop d2 move for free, and I think that that is going to let me develop a rook to the c file a little bit quicker. All right, so now I think this is an instructive moment. b6 is the top move, and already there's a large trap that white has to watch out for. If we play knight e5, black has to be extremely careful, and black, in fact, must take on d4. If black plays bishop b7, we have the very nice shot bishop a6, which is basically winning for white. The engine doesn't quite appreciate it because queen c8 does defend for a moment, but black cannot take on a6 because white has this very nice win. After knight takes c6, forking, the queen moves. Now we take on e7, and after black takes back on e7, we have the very nice shot knight d5, and even though we're not up material, we're completely winning for white. Black is going to have to move this queen out of the way, and then we're going to take on f6, and there's no good defense to these mates.
Yeah, that I guess queen f4 is at least something that lives for a minute, but
yeah, a very, very brief moment though. We're going to be able to lift a rook and have this very nice attack in short order.
Yeah, you don't just need the queen to or sorry, it's not only the queen who can own the g file.
Right.
Yeah.
All right, so that's just a nice trick to file away. Here, if pawn takes Tyler, we can take the whole queen. We're double pinned on both the knight and the pawn. Yeah, so Richie, I think that it's extremely important to keep the opening prep to something very, very narrow. I think that if you try and memorize everything, you don't know any of it. I think it's a Napoleon line, but to defend everything is to defend nothing. It's more important to know just enough to get to a position that you're comfortable with and a position that you're willing to play for both colors. And I think that if you try and memorize everything, you're never going to remember the important lines when they show up in a game. All right, King Lear, huh? Okay.
I've thought about it. At the outset of the opening, it appears very solid. but nonetheless invariably descends into chaos.
Yeah, that's fair. And one of the kings is going to die, so it checks out.
Exactly.
All right, so we've kind of dispensed with b6, but let's briefly talk about what happens after queen c8. So we do want to know what to do in this best move for white. And here I think that queen f3 gives white a nice advantage. You'll see that the engine is saying plus 0.5. I think that plus 0.5 is not a clear edge, but a nice edge to play with, practically speaking. Black is going to have to find some very concrete moves to survive. Bishop a6 immediately runs into this stuff. I think that this is pretty bad. When the only move to survive is bishop d8, something has gone horribly wrong. We can take and play rook d1. This pin is unbreakable. d5 is coming. White doesn't have to worry about bishop b7 because that hangs the whole bishop. So we just have a very nice position that's easy to play. And in the absolute worst case, we can trade everything, play d5, and play with this nice structure. I don't know whether I'd take with the knight or the rook. Probably the knight because I get the extra tempo. But I think that the doubled f-pawns, the centralized rooks, this is a bailout position for white. This is the absolute minimum that we're going to get in this position, and I'm happy to play this position for a win. So again, Richie, it's like you mentioned, I want to memorize the bare minimum of concrete lines. So by filing that away, it might be even better to play bishop h4, but I can figure that out over the board. I don't have to decide right now when I'm doing my prep. All right, so after queen f3, it looks like the most common move is going to be knight d8, or the strongest move. Knight a5 is also in my file, and after knight a5, I've decided to take everything on b7 and then play knight c6. And the reason that we're doing this is that we're going to be able to get a long-term pawn structure advantage. Either we're going to get this dark square bishop and then be able to take on f6, or if bishop d6 comes in, then we get to take here and then play d5, and we get this structure instead where both of the knights are doing yeoman's work to take control of the center.
Yep, and you've gotten rid of your isolated queen pawn, and black's pawns look miserable, and yeah, I'll take that.
Yeah, that's a really good point. All right, so that's a really interesting question. Are there any thematic similarities? Unfortunately, because this is so concrete, there aren't tons of thematic similarities. Where we're really going to find the themes is when we start playing and somebody plays an inaccurate move. And their inaccurate move might not be a large advantage for me, but I'm going to be able to draw on all of these themes that we've just looked at and find a move that lets me play a position that I'm comfortable with. So I might not have anything that wins immediately, but for example here, if black takes, I'm going to recognize that after taking and knight d5, I can probably take a bunch of pieces and solve my Isolani and be comfortable. So here I'd probably take with the bishop. If the queen takes, I would be fine taking on d5 and playing with my connected pawns against black's Isolani. We've kind of had a role reversal here. And if instead black takes with the knight, now I'm happy to gain a tempo by playing queen f3, bring a rook to the center. And again, I don't have an Isolani anymore. I've moved this pawn over to e5, and I think this is a very clear edge for white after a move like queen c7. I think that I can probably now play to bring a knight to the d6 square. Richie, thank you so much for the sub. It's great to have you here, and we really appreciate that everybody is showing up to participate and analyze with us.
Yeah, doubled.
Alrighty. There's one other thing that I want to talk about in this position, and that is what happens if black doesn't play b6. So we were talking about knight b4, and that was why a3 is a common move here, because it stops knight b4. I don't like a3 for white because I play this as black, and I think that this position after b6 is a very easy position for black to play. Yes, we would rather have the knight back on b8 and the bishop on b7 if we could magically switch which move we played way back on move 5. But I don't think that this knight is a real detriment to the black position. We'd rather have it on d5 or d7 so that it can reinforce the d5 square, but the fact that this bishop is coming to b7 more than makes up for any edge white has. All right, so because of that, after bishop g5, we have to consider the concrete lines b6 and knight b4. So if knight b4, we have to decide whether we're willing to trade off this bishop on d3. I personally don't want to trade off that bishop on d3, so I would like to play bishop b1, and I'm happy to go for this position because I have permanent control of the e5 square. I don't have to play knight e5 right away. I can play queen d3 first. Yeah, you're exactly right. Bishop b1, and then you can get the tempo back with a3 if black tries to play something like b6. And here already, I think that white has a very nice advantage because this bishop doesn't contribute to the not getting mated ideas that black has to come up with. All right, so let's look at this position after knight d5. If we play knight e5 right away, we do have to worry about what happens after knight c3 and queen c7. I think that concretely in this position, there are too many ideas like queen d3, g6 is forced now, the queen can swing over to h3, and we're going to have some very nice ideas of knight g4 and knight h6. This looks like a very easy position to play for white. I would say that the only way to really have a good feel for this is to play 100 blitz games in this type of position. And it doesn't have to come out of this position. Like you said, the Alapin is common as well. I think that you can see this in some French positions, especially when black is taking on e4 with like a Fort Knox or something like that. And this is... black is going to be able to hold with best play, but it's a position that's very easy for white to play. Yeah, the modern as well, although usually black is not playing e6 in a modern because this structure is just so bad with the pawns on the light squares.
Yeah, and the bishop being on e7 seems strange for a modern.
Yeah, it does, although there are a few lines where that happens, but yeah, you're right, it's definitely not the desired square. All right, so again, I don't want to dive into this position too much because I think we know enough of the ideas to be able to fake it. But concretely, let's look at what happens after b6 here. b6, we should be able to see that after knight c6, we're just going to have an absolutely massive advantage. We're going to be able to take on e7. Black must take back with the knight because taking with the queen loses a piece. And after he takes back with the knight, we can take on f6, and now we have this permanent weakness on the light squares. Probably knight e4 is best, but queen f3 and queen h5 are also interesting. Yeah, let's just say knight e4 because we're hitting f6. King g7 is going to run into moves like queen g4. And again, this is why I like the engine. The engine instantly says that taking on f6 is the strongest move. Drawing the king out, we get to play queen h5. The king cannot run back because of queen h7. And now we see that this is just an extremely easy position to play for white. Even though we've sacrificed a piece and we will have to find a few accurate moves, it's not going to be too difficult to do. I think that there are going to be rook lifts aplenty. Here you'd want to think carefully about what move to play. Bishop e4 looks the most natural to me. But it's just a very, very easy position to play. Yeah, queen f3, we're probably very close to picking off this rook, although I do want to watch out for things like bishop b7 or knight c6 when my queen gets a little bit trapped. But this does look pretty easy to play for white.
Rook lifts aplenty. I think that's one of the verses from the 12 Days of Chessmas. Thank you. I'll just be in my corner. Yeah, also taking on f6 is boss as hell. I think that we all live for opportunities to play moves like that.
Yeah, exactly. And then this is, again, why we analyze with the engine on. We want to see if there are any other moves that are worth considering. h6 I don't really think is worth spending too much time on. I'm going to get this knight out of dodge and then play queen d3 and go for some cheap mates. And this is actually something that we'll see on the bishop b4 lines in a little bit. If we can force black to play h6, that's usually a permanent weakening of the light squares that is very hard to untangle from. All right, I truly think this is enough, so I think that we can safely move on to the other line. I think there's more to look at, but again, I think that we've looked at enough lines, and I think that this is enough to remember. It's bite-sized. I can remember everything that we've looked at so far, and this is only with the positions after bishop f6 and knight f6, which again are the most common moves and what you're far more likely to run into than anything else. All right, so backing way up, the other line that we have to consider is bishop b4. Once again, I want to minimize what I have to memorize, so I'm going to say we're going to take on d5 and go for similar structures. Now in this position, there are two moves. There's queen c3 and bishop d2. Queen c2, the idea, of course, is to defend the knight. I think that the most common continuation actually transposes after knight c6, bishop d3 castles, and now if we play bishop d2, we're basically transposing back to the other line. And other than this, this is a concrete line that we have to worry about if the knight grabs on d4. This gets a little bit chaotic. I think there was a Najdorf-Portisch game in this line, and I think it's actually in my file coming from the other variation. Bear with me for one moment, and I'll see if I can find it for my edification.
While you're looking for that, I just want to double up on Richie's comment that, yeah, I think even with as much as I've played this and have had pretty decent results, I still think that I'm struck by the same thing, that I often give in to my internal pressure and start defending that d4 pawn. And the way that you consistently, and we've looked at these lines together a number of different times, and you consistently chuck that pawn into the fire without a second thought. And I think that's the kind of inspiration that I need to keep having and get more into these concrete details so I can trust it more.
Yeah, exactly. Actually, you can see my notes have the game right here. So we can look at it from the other move order. So, and again, that's because I didn't want to spend too much time on queen c2. I think that bishop d2 is a little bit more common. Actually, did I even consider bishop d2, or did I? So I might have said it backwards. So even though I might want to play bishop d2, I think that my notes have queen c2 because that is the more flexible line. We can actually see which one's more common. Nope, there's bishop d2. I was looking for that. Okay, so yeah, bishop d2, and we actually transpose right back. But this does give the extra flexibility of black retreating this piece. So again, this is just something that it gets to be a little bit much when the file has all these variations.
Yeah, I mean, you've sent me a couple of these files before as an aid to my preparation, and I will say the sneaky detail of sharing these things is that if the person, speaking mainly for myself, that having not made them myself, it was always really hard to make hide or hair of them. You know, it's something that you gain best benefit when you know what it all means, and sometimes starting from scratch might have actually been better for me, I realized later. Although I still appreciate the gift.
Maybe sometime we can look at how to use chess base effectively, because there are ways to search for positions, which might help.
Yeah, I mean, maybe that's even something we can look at for Thursday, just as it makes such a nice companion to this. But we'll see. It could be something to look at for next week.
Yeah, that's a good idea. All right, so let's get to that Najdorf-Portisch game that I was referencing. And this is kind of, if you've looked at the games and you remember this, it's useful. If you don't, that's totally fine as well. I think I saw this in chat already, but queen takes d4, and it's already a sneaky position because we can't take either piece. Taking on b4 hangs the rook, and of course taking the queen is illegal because the pawn is pinned. So the best move here, and again, this is from the Najdorf-Portisch game, is bishop b5 check. And we can actually see that this has been played quite a bunch of times. So we have a Nunn-Lobron game that is also worth looking at later. I think that this is in the file somewhere. And I've actually had a position just like this in an over-the-board game as well. So bishop b5, of course, the idea is to force the king to move. Bishop d7 hangs the house. After the queen takes, we can safely capture on b4. And if the king takes, now we have queen check, and we can take on b4. Yeah, exactly. So king must go to f8, and after king f8, we can castle, and we just have a nice advantage. All right, so in the Najdorf-Portisch game, instead the move played was king to e7. And now white castled, black took on c3. So looking at the material, black is up 2 whole pawns, but in exchange, white has a massive development advantage. Of course, if white takes on c3, that's a huge blunder. Even though we're getting this tempo, the king can safely come to f6. The rook doesn't really have any useful lifts. The king is going to be able to hide safely. Probably something very benign like g6 would be sufficient. The engine is pointing out that h5 and bishop a5 are sufficient. And white is going to have to scramble to make a draw. I think that white has decent drawing chances because of the lack of development. But this is not what I'm hoping for in my openings.
It's funny. I think there's a good example of where I might overestimate my chances. Not in preparation, of course, right? You have the benefit of the engine. But I think if this happened to me over the board, I would assume that those bishops were dangerous enough to make something good happen.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think that's why it has to be done with the engine. I don't think that you can get away with looking at positions only over the board in this day and age. Because Stockfish is so strong and your opponents are almost guaranteed to be using Stockfish, we also have to use Stockfish.
Yeah.
All right, so I actually found this Najdorf-Portisch game in ChessBase when I was preparing it. Their game was from 1962. I don't think we have games going back that far in the Lead Chess Masters database, so that's why it's not showing up here. But just to show you the game, white played queen e2 now. Did he... King e7, castles... Yeah, queen e2, bishop d6, bishop b2 with a tempo on the queen. The queen moved back to a5. We brought a rook to the center, and already you can see that rook takes d6 is a monstrous threat. Yeah, queen a4 might be even better than queen e2, but I think it's more important to learn the themes by looking at these Grandmaster games than playing the objectively correct move, because I don't want to have to memorize this. I want to just know the themes and then be able to figure it out when I get to the board. I'm a busy guy. I don't have all that much time to memorize. If I were Carlsen or Caruana preparing for a match, I might spend 10 hours a day memorizing lines. But I'm not. I have a day job. I have other things that I want to do. I want to be able to say, this is a good position. I remember 2 key ideas, and I will spend all of my time figuring out when to play those ideas. All right, so just to continue the game, rook d8. Now we had the very nice idea of queen to h5 with some very nasty threats. Queen g5 is bad. That would probably force the king to a light square eventually, and we might have discoveries. So black played f6 here. Now we took, and after king to f7, Najdorf very wisely brought the bishop to a better diagonal, and this was enough to almost instantly force resignation. Bishop c1 is a beautiful move. The queen is totally dominated. If the queen moves, the bishop comes in, and there's no good defense for black. Here we have a very quick mate. We can take on g7, and the king has run out of squares. And if The game continuation, I believe, was bishop h2, and after queen e5, picking up this bishop, f4 was played, and now Portish resigned, realizing that he cannot take because this back rank is too weak and there are too many mates.
Wow. Wow. Yeah, and the bishop and rook never make it into the game.
Yep. Yeah,
Awesome.
very cool game. I think that's a fun one.
Yeah.
So again, I think that's enough. I think that we don't have to spend more time on this queen d4 move. The only thing I want to remember concretely is that I'm going to play bishop b5, force the king to a bad square, and then castle and play chess. You can see that it's already +1 here, and if king e7, it's still +1. I'll figure it out over the board. I don't mind. I might want to play queen a4. I might play queen e2 like Nadorf did. And no matter what I play, I think that I can play for a win, even if I don't remember something concrete.
Yeah, that's great stuff, Andrew. Thank you so much for sharing it with all of us. I mean, it's tremendously detailed, and it shows the level of dedication that you've spent. As much as you make a large point out of your practicality, I think it's still clear that you've spent a heck of a lot of time here.
Yeah, and it's a lot of time over a lot of different days and nights, and I've studied the position slowly. So that's why it's kind of a long process as opposed to something where you can just know it right away. So one thing that I do want to point out is I've actually had this position in an over-the-board game, and my opponent played the main move bishop a5. After bishop a5, Black's idea is that he's going to go for this same idea of taking on d4, but now the bishop is not going to be hanging on b4, and the queen controls the a4 square. So in this position, the main move is actually a3. That is what I played in the game. And now my opponent took on c4 and took on d4. I took back. And here I played bishop b5 check. King f8 was played. And after king f8, I castled. I'm just looking on the other screen to find what move I played. And my opponent played queen f6 here. The main move is queen c3. After queen c3, I was willing to play queen b1 or queen e2. I think I had decided in the game when I was sitting there spending my time to play queen e2. It's very difficult to actually take this successfully because bishop b2 and the queen is very quickly running out of squares. For example, queen a2 looks like it's getting out, but because of the lousy position of the king on g7, it doesn't quite work.
Question from the chat, Andrew. How long before you think that a study session starts to hit diminishing returns?
I think it depends on what you're doing. If you're doing the initial generation of ideas, if I'm looking at something for the first time and I'm just throwing ideas out there, I will find that it's very productive for as long as I'm willing to do it. I personally can't really spend more than 4 hours in front of the computer without getting up and taking a break, but I don't think that there's a downside because I'm not trying to memorize it at that point. I'm just trying to generate the ideas, and then later I'll go back and memorize it. Tonight, this is about me refreshing my memory, looking at these ideas. I haven't seen these in a long time. While I could probably come up with them over the board if I had this tomorrow, I can't guarantee that. And that's why every so often I do like to go through this and file it back away. There are a ton of different ideas. I am willing to play a lot of these moves. We're seeing variations. I could play this. I could play that. I don't necessarily want to commit to something, but I think that it's important to refresh it, double check it with modern games. It's probably been 6 or 7 years since I looked at most of these lines initially. Things change. Engines get better. Grandmasters play these positions and come up with new ideas. So all of those things kind of force you to look at your repertoire periodically.
I want to add on to that, too, that for me, it's always been, as far as study sessions go, very much learning how to pay attention to my own feelings. And funnily enough, I'm not going to go into any depth on this, but my actor training has definitely helped me to become more aware of my physical and emotional state. And if I find that I've started to drift in my attention or my interest, I just stop. I mean, it's very easy to tell. after a while of paying attention to it, that I'm not getting the same return out of what I'm doing anymore, because as much as I love chess, sometimes I'm just not there for it because of energy or because of something distracting me. Now, that being said, if you're watching our stream, I feel that your study session should be about as long as the stream, maybe 5 minutes longer.
That is a good point. Nick, is there ever a game you don't look at because it's too old? I think that more likely I wouldn't look at a game between 2400s that was 20 years old. But I would be willing to look at any strong players' games of any rating if it's played recently. And I'm always willing to look at the games from candidates matches or something like that in the 50s and 60s. All right, so this is where we come to the crux of the difference between the Nadorf-Portisch game and this one. The difference is that if black plays a6, and you'll see that's the main move, if I now play bishop b2, it doesn't work out as well as in the game. And that's because my b5 bishop is hanging, so black can play queen d2 and more or less force a queen exchange. I have to take or do something that allows black to take on e2, because both my queen and bishop are hanging here. So I don't have time to play something like queen e5 because black is going to be able to pick off this bishop. Yes, black has to start with f6 so that he's not going to get mated and lose a rook. But I think that f6 is certainly something that my opponent could find. And here I don't have any good attacking ideas. Both bishops are hanging. I cannot defend both of them. So that's kind of as far as I need to go here. So that's the key difference here. And that is why I think that it's important after a6 to play bishop d3. And yeah, I'm willing to go for this position where I have a queen for two rooks. And that's because I have the bishop pair and the rooks are very inactive. The engine says minus 0.5, so the engine likes black here. But again, I think that a human playing over the board is going to have a hard time finding some of these moves.
Right. Yeah, I mean, depending on the time left to each player and whether I'm playing up, I gotta say, especially if I'm playing someone equal rating or lower, I have to assume that I'm cutting their throat at some point. It's just too easy to screw up.
Yeah, definitely. And actually, as I am sitting here, I realize that it's probably even better to take back with the king in this position. So after queen takes, there's no reason not to play king takes, leave the queen active where she can come to a couple of squares. And queen e5 is already a big threat, which would be forking some terrible things.
Terrible things.
All right, so the main move instead of queen c3, in my estimation, is queen f6. And this is a game I played against an FM from Boston in the 2017 Boylston Chess Club Championship. In this position, I played bishop b2. Maybe not the most accurate, but it's a move that gives me a position that I'm comfortable with, so I was happy to play it. You'll see that there are no games in our reference database, so this is something that has not been played as far as I can tell. I'm just going to double check in ChessBase as well. ChessBase also doesn't find anything, so there are no games between 2500s in the last 10 years here. All right, so here we're just kind of making it up. I was happy with bishop b2. I think it's a good move. My opponent played e5. I brought my queen to a more active square. I'm threatening moves like e4. I'm threatening to bring the rooks into the center now. He played queen f5, trying to trade off queens. And we actually agreed to a pretty quick draw. We repeated moves a couple of times and we shook hands. I was playing up a couple hundred points, so I was okay with a draw. I think I had lost the previous game, so from a tournament standpoint, I was happy to get back onto the plus side of the column. But here, if I absolutely had to play on for a win, I think I would probably have to try something like queen a4. Or back here, instead of queen e4, the other move to consider is c4. And the idea behind c4 is that this is giving the bishop a little bit of space to sneak out. We're putting the bishop on a much stronger diagonal, and now we're more ready to play queen e4 and threaten to take on e5. Anything I missed there, John? Anything that you wanted to look at or think about?
No, I mean not at present, Andrew. I confess that I sometimes get overwhelmed in the whirlwind. I think it's great stuff, as I said, but I'm afraid I don't have the most searing, incisive questions at this moment.
Yeah, all right. That's fair. I think it's kind of a good example of why it's important to have some practical experience in these positions. I think that it's much easier to figure these things out if you've played a game or two in these positions.
Yeah, and I mean, I will say I'm definitely continually struck by sometimes the small difference between an attacking position which is promising and an attacking position which merely looks promising. And that, again, being an indicator of why preparation and experience is so important, because you very much want one and not the other when you are playing an important game.
Yes. Yep, that's a really good way to phrase it. So the last line that I wanted to look at is this one, where black castles and we play bishop d2 right away. Uh, I guess I got the move order a little bit wrong. This is really something that would come out of the bishop d2 move order, and that's because now we're targeting h7. So if black castle's here, we can play queen c2, eyeing this pawn. And here is where we were talking about if black plays h6, this is now a permanent weakening of the light squares. So the idea of queen e2 and queen e4 and finding a mate on h7 is very good for white. It's going to take a long time to do that, but file that away. I think that there's a pretty real chance that you would get that in a game. Here, I will point out that after castles, bishop e7, it's very important to play a3. We do not want a knight to come to these squares and take off our bishop. We really need that knight in order to have good attacking chances.
And, yeah, I would go so far as to say that realizing that's maybe a good example for people who want to try and watch this and memorize any part of it, that noticing that bishop on b4 is the only reason this idea is playable right here.
Yeah, that's a really good way to frame it. So in all of these positions, and again, I just clicked on a random square, but we get to this same type of structure. I'm comfortable playing this. If we have not played bishop d2 quite as early, so if we get to something like this, I'm sorry, if we haven't played queen c2 as early, you can also consider queen e2 to e4 to attack the pawn this way. Here, almost certainly, black will be putting one of the knights on b4. I'm not sure it even makes a difference which, but I do think that it's important to keep this bishop, so either bishop e4 or bishop c4 or bishop b1. In this position, I would not go to b1 when I have the e4 square available, and only if we get this knight f6 idea, now would I consider a move like bishop b1. But this is the ideal setup for black. Black is getting absolutely everything. Both knights are coming to d5, the bishop's coming to b7. I think it's fair to say black has a nice advantage in this position, so we should avoid this. And we have two local Boston people playing a game in this position in 2008, and the author of Ribka playing this position in 2000. So it's got a pretty good pedigree.
Yeah, those are some pretty storied names.
Yeah.
At least if you're a Boston local.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So again, yeah, Richie, you're exactly right. A3 is a necessity once knights can come to b4. All right, so John, do you want to play a game in one of these lines, or do you want to look at the end game line and the knight c6 stuff?
Ooh, I'm game to do either one. Why don't we show them the end game line, though? That seems like a pretty worthwhile conclusion, inclusion, and perhaps conclusion.
All right, that's a good point. Yeah, so I think that Vigorito's books are excellent. He's one of the biggest experts on openings, and he knows how to analyze exceptionally well, so his books are always giving topical and important lines. I've enjoyed a couple of his lectures at the Boylston Chess Club, so I think it's he's a good guy to be looking for books from. All right, so let's take a look at the endgame line now. The key point of the endgame line is black skips this e6 move in order to play bishop g4 in one move. And now white has a few ways to play, but the most common is to take on d5. If bishop takes f3, this is inaccurate because now the queen can take on f3 and we don't have to create any weaknesses over here. So black must take back on d5 with the knight if black wants to play for a real advantage. And now white plays queen b3, forking the knight and the pawn on b7. Black takes on f3 first. White, of course, cannot take on d5 because this bishop is defending it. So instead, we have to take back. And now there are two moves. There's knight b6, in which case black is saying he wants to keep all of his pawns and just try and play against this structure. In exchange, white has this very nice light square bishop, and we have the bishop pair, which is always nice, and we have more space. Or the more topical line is e6. And after e6, white is going to take on b7, and we can already see that this has a massive 72% of games being drawn here.
Wow. Yeah.
All right, so unfortunately, there's very little deviation here. Black must play all of these moves that have been played hundreds of times over. Otherwise, black is going to get to a very bad position very quickly. And it's important to file away as white if you're playing this. If black does not play one of these moves, stop and think. It's the most important moment of the game when your opponent plays a move that you don't recognize because your opponent might have just given you a nice edge. All right, so going back to the concrete line, we play bishop b5, black takes, and instead of taking on b5, we play queen c6 check, and that's because we want to force king e7. Queen d7, of course, hangs the entire rook, and this is completely winning for white after we take on d5. So instead, king e7, and only now do we take on b5. One sneaky line, we can also play queen c5 check here, and it looks like it's gambiting a piece because knight d6 is playable, but it's very bad for black to try and hang on to this piece, and here I think that white is very, very close to winning, even though the engine doesn't really appreciate it at depth 22. We're not really going to get into that tonight, but just know that after queen c5, you probably have to be willing to repeat and go for a draw if that's what white is looking for.
But you could always, if I'm understanding correctly, you could always try it once.
Only if you're willing to go for it, but yes. You have to be willing to play this a piece down and play on for the win with white.
Right. You'd better be well prepared. I mean, you'd better have uncovered some of the things that you're alluding to as to why white is okay. But,
yes, but if you're willing to do that, it is a nice sneaky way to play. I think that queen d6 is also a move that you're going to have to look at if you're going to play this way, as well as what happens in this position where the queen does come to d7 and the king is back on e8. It's a subtle difference between the lines with the king on e7.
Yeah.
The main difference is that after knight takes, we cannot play queen takes because of this pin. So after e takes, we would try and keep the queens on as white. All right, so again, we're going to look at the main move, which is queen takes right away. And after queen takes, black plays queen d7. There is another line with knight takes c3 and then rook b8. And black can play this way if black is trying to play for a win in this position. I think that this is a way that I would play as black if I were playing a lower rated player. Although I don't necessarily think bishop g4 is the correct way to play if you're playing a lower rated player. I think that going for those isolanis are much better. And then in this position, I think that black is probably going to play queen d7 instead of taking on c3 most of the time, so I don't want to spend too much time on knight takes c3. Yeah, the line that Richie just alluded to, I definitely glossed over that, but here, after knight takes d5, we do not ever have to worry about queen takes b5 because we'll be up a whole piece. And we'll actually see that theme in a couple of sidelines here. Again, that's not something that we're really going to get into, but if you're playing this position and your opponent deviates, you must look for this idea of knight c7 forking the queen and the king. All right, so after queen takes b5, queen d7, now we take on d5. Taking back with the pawn is inaccurate because we can move the queen and keep the queens on. With the queens on, even though black has this passed pawn and the better pawn structure long term, concretely, the king is stuck in the middle. We're going to castle really quickly. The rooks float to the center, and this is a very, very tough position for black to hold. Already you'll see that it's +1, and it gets even worse if you make some natural looking moves. F6 to try and develop. We can castle. If king f7, we can play rook d1, threatening to win a pawn. If rook d8, we play this bishop e3 move, targeting the a7 pawn, and already it's very, very difficult for black to hold everything. I don't think queen a6 is the best move, but this idea is a good one to know. We're going to try and scoop up the a7 pawn. There was also a Fischer game in this position after pawn takes. I don't remember if he played queen e2 or queen d3. I don't know if I have that in my file. Let me look real quick. I don't have the right database to find that, so I'll have to look at that later. But there is a Fischer game in this position. You can look it up on your own. And it was either queen d3 or queen e2. I think it was queen d3, but queen e2 is also good. All right, so instead, after takes, queen d5 is far more common. And now white plays bishop g5. One very common mistake is to take on d5 immediately, and I've actually had this many, many times as black in bullet games, and this is actually a nice position for black because we have not pushed this f-pawn to f6. The pawn on f6 actually is slightly detrimental to the position because we lose some ideas of g6 and h5 to expand that way. So instead, bishop g5 first. Queen takes is, of course, a terrible move because it's defended with the x-ray tactic. And now after f6, we take on d5, and then we play bishop e3, putting the bishop on its most natural square. And now black must play king e6, and this is the heart of the endgame line. White castles long, immediately putting pressure on d5. Black tries to develop with bishop b4, and white plays a3. Now, in this position, the most common move is rook h to c8, but in that game that I alluded to before where I beat Shmilov, who's a very strong 2500, he played rook a to c8, and this is a mistake because now you'll see that this a pawn is immediately hanging. And in our game, he played bishop c5, and now I played the best move, rook e1, threatening discoveries. And after this position, I played rook d to e1, taking over the e-file, threatening to come into e7, and I was able to win without too much trouble. There are just too many weaknesses in the black camp to hold indefinitely. All right, so the main move, let's just hop back to the main move, is rook h to c8. After rook h to c8, we must play king b1. There's literally no other move that isn't ridiculous. And now black plays bishop c5. If black plays bishop a5 instead, this is an inaccuracy again because of b4. And after b4, if bishop to b6, we once again put the rook on e1. If the king moves here, we throw in this very nice check. And now we're going to get this very nice penetration with the rook to the 7th rank, and d5 will be hanging. The engine says 0. I don't trust that for even a second. I think that white has some extremely good winning chances here. And it looks like rook d3 was played a couple of times in the 90s, and white won one of those games. All right, so again, back to the main line. After king b1, bishop c5 is the main move. And now the player that I want to point out is George Meyer. He is the person to look at if you're going to play this line for white. He has had many, many very nice games in the Panov Botvinnik attack. So after rook e1, black must take. King d6 does not work because, once again, bishop f4. This is a very important idea to know. And here, after the king goes back, we simply drop the rook back to e2, and we're winning the d5 pawn. Yeah, Nick, this is something that's very unique to this endgame line, and that's because we play up to move 14 with extremely forcing moves. So if there are other lines that you're playing, and the first 14 moves are basically all known to theory, yeah, you might get to move 21. But other than that, I wouldn't worry about it. So here, after takes king d6, we once again play rook e1. Rook d3 is a mistake because after rook c5, we're defending the pawn sufficiently. And after b4, rook b8 pins the pawn. And after the king moves, we can very safely say that black has defended everything sufficiently. Black is putting some good pressure on b4. And in this case, any rook endgame with the 3-on-3 is going to be a draw at best for white, maybe even losing.
Yeah, and I just have to note that I might, foolishly in a blitz game try something there like a4 just to try and keep attacking and take on d5. But I have to imagine that the black rook's control of the b file is just going to be entirely too much.
Yeah, exactly. You run out of checks very quickly, actually. So here, the king can come up to f5, and the king hides on g6 and is perfectly fine. And now it's black's turn to take all of your pawns.
Yeah.
So already we can see the danger. Hanging a mate in 1 would not be ideal. So we have to go to a1. And now with the king on a1, black always has at least a draw with this type of thing. And black realistically has even more than that by taking the h2 pawn off.
Yeah, I mean, who would do that? Rufus? Who would overpress in a draw and endgame?
Yeah, I've done that a few times. So let's not spend too much time on that. All right, yeah, so instead of rook d3, because again, I don't think it's best, rook e1 is better. And now black must find rook c4, which is the only move, a surprising fact. And now we really want to look at the George Meyer games here. I think that he has had a few games in this line. And his preferred move is actually to play rook to e7. So rook e7 and rook e6 are both moves, but I think rook e7 is a little bit better. It immediately pressures these pawns. Black has to go for rook h4 and counterattack. Now we check with the other rook. And after king c5, we can surprisingly trap the king in a few mating nets. So I just want to look at that Meyer game because I think that is a useful way to learn some ideas. But I don't want to spend too much time trying to memorize specifics because I'm not going to try and remember the exact line here. I think we've already spent plenty of time on the first 24 moves. Instead, we just want to know some of these key ideas. So in the game Meyer-Saltev from 2006 in the Bundesliga, we got to this position, and now Saltev played h5. I'm probably butchering the pronunciations, but h5 is not best because now we have king c2, and surprisingly this hangs the f2 pawn with check, but taking on f2 is a large mistake because now we see that the king is caught in a mating net. The king cannot come forward, and we are prepared to play moves like rook c7, b4, rook c5, and rook a5 mate.
One note, Andrew, just because it's very simple and interesting, is that if they try to take the b pawn, for example, they fall immediately victim to a skewer.
Yes.
Just wanted to mention that because it would seem to resolve some of those mating problems.
Definitely.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's a really good thing to point out, and I think that is a useful concept to be aware of. The b2 pawn is often protected that way. So in the game, rook h4 was played. After rook h4, Meyer played b4, forcing the king to a lousy square. The king came up the board to d4. And now we see that we don't have any checks on the king immediately, so we have to rearrange our pieces in order to now go after the d5 pawn. Black tried to activate his last piece. The king comes up the board. We had a random check on c3. And black decided to go for this defense from d3. However, it doesn't quite work out, and that's because after rook d7, king c4, now we attack the pawn from c5. And with the two rooks attacking d5, it's time to resign for black. There is no good way to defend the d5 pawn and avoid mates. And you'll see that the only move that doesn't force mate is giving up the rook, either on a3 or f3. Do you have an OnlyFans?
Just move along. Just move along. I'm managing the chat. You're doing great.
All right, so I think that's enough of the endgame line for now. I think we've seen a couple of different ways that it can go wrong, and even though it's often considered to be a draw, I think that this shows that there's enough play and there are enough mistakes for black to make that you can certainly play it for a win, at least up until the 2,500 level.
Yeah.
For those of you 2,600s in the chat, please feel free to let me know, and I would be happy to take some lessons and learn how to play this better.
I feel like we've seen Komodo in the chat before.
Yeah, exactly. All right, so now with that introduction, should we play a game in the Panov? You can take white and see what you remember, what you learned.
Oh, God. I'll be honest. I feel like trying to sort of be a part of the show and learn from it at the same time was remarkably difficult. But yeah, I'll do my best, and I'll make a fool of myself for the education of the chat.
I was counting on that. All right.
I got a little self-conscious about sitting there open-mouthed as I tried to absorb everything, and I decided to move back into more of a, let me crack jokes and run the chat kind of a role. I definitely remember the beginning, though.
Yeah, exactly. Richie, I think that is a good starting point. Start with 2,300, and we'll go from there. So I'm going to focus on the first things that we talked about, and we will... John, if you have questions, feel free to ask, and I'll help you out with remembering the stuff that we just talked about.
Naturally. All right. Well, I have to say that I feel good that you have already decided to take the end game off the table. Although that was the most recently covered thing, so it might have been my best chance. But, okay, bishop e7. Right. So now I need to... Okay, this is interesting. Yeah. So I know that, right, this is one of those moments where I'm not even necessarily remembering tonight, I confess, as much as I plan to rewatch this myself. But I don't necessarily want to move the bishop already, the light squared bishop, because it feels much like those Queen's Gambit ideas, you win a tempo, I should just take on d5. So I think that's what I'm supposed to do, because knight to c6 obviously is the best line for c5, so we're not going to play that. So I think probably takes here makes sense. Yeah, it seems to line up with what I remember. I have played my move.
Okay. That is correct. And now I'll take back with the knight because I want to keep the Isolani. And now the main move that we had talked about was bishop d3.
Exactly. Yeah. This actually is not outside of my prep yet. It was much more the later stuff where I started to gawk. Andrew is kind enough to waste away some of my considerable time disadvantage that I've already accrued.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I think worst case, I'll add time because I do think it's important to think about the position and try and remember what we just talked about.
Right. I think that does make sense. Yeah, so castles here I think makes sense. Obviously, queen c2 would be an enormous mistake, inviting knight b4 right away.
Yes, exactly.
Ooh, Richie wants to know your opinion on the bishop e6 Panov lines.
On the bishop which?
Bishop e6.
Yes. So I think that that's also a lot of fun to play for black. I think it's a nice way to avoid some of the lines like this that John and I are getting into. I personally prefer this stuff to the g6 and bishop e6 stuff. They're very similar because usually if you play the bishop on e6, you have to play g6 to finish your development. But I do agree that it's a nice way to avoid the endgame line if you don't want to deal with that. And it's a nice way to consolidate what you have to learn as black, because I think that the bishop e6 stuff solves the bishop g5 Panov very nicely.
Okay, so I feel like A3 is the move that I know you do not play. I feel like I digested that much from this evening. But it's definitely the move that I know in these positions
Yeah,
because
so
it
we
stops
just
some of the
talked about
useful
Rookie
things.
1.
Right, right. That is what I remembered as well.
Okay.
Okay. I feel better.
Yeah. And now we had talked about two different ways of playing either bishop f6 or knight f6. I'm going to play knight f6 because that's a little bit more my style here. But bishop f6, that was when we were talking about after bishop f6, you play bishop e4, taking advantage of the fact that there's not a knight covering the e4 square.
Right, that makes sense.
And actually, I'm going to flip my board so that everybody can see it from the white perspective because that will match what everybody else was looking at all night.
That makes a lot of sense too. I feel like bishop f4 makes a lot of sense here.
It might, but that was not the move that we had talked about. So bishop
Forgive me.
f4, we had talked about either a3 or bishop g5.
Right. Okay. Let's look at the bishop g5 stuff.
Okay, so this is what we had talked about earlier tonight, and I think this is the line that I want people to mainly take away from tonight. And that's because I think that bishop g5 is immediately putting the bishop on its most natural square, g5. And I think that this allows me to fall into the trap with b6 right away. Again, after b6, there's that knight e5, bishop b7, bishop a6 trick.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
Richie, I think we looked at bishop d2 after bishop b4. Yeah, exactly, with the knight still on d5. So here I have a couple of options. I am going to go for knight b4.
Sure, that makes sense.
And I don't actually think we talked about this tonight. So this is a little bit of a curveball. I'll add a little bit of time so that we have some time to talk about it. But the idea is that this is going to let my knight come to d5, and it's a natural looking move in the position, even if it's not one of the best moves.
Yeah. Okay, so I can't think that I want to let you have that bishop. On the other hand, playing to bishop to b1, which I confess I think I'm going to do anyway, but playing bishop to b1 feels like it does kind of temporarily create some discombobulation for sure. I can't get my a1 rook out as an example. I know from a lot of French defense positions that I don't necessarily care, that sometimes white will do this. He will tuck the bishop on b1, he will kick the knight away, and then carry on putting his bishop back on c2 or something like that, and it's just not that material. But those positions are closed, and this one's a little bit more open. So I'm a little uncertain. Another possibility would be to play bishop c4, because I know the d5 break is always important, but knight back to d5 is also going to shut that down pretty quick. And I admit I do lose some of my quick checkmating ideas on h7 that I love so much. But that's probably a bit of a crutch. So after taking 39 years, I'm going to try this.
Yeah, and we did talk about this very briefly, and this is exactly what we had talked about in order to try and punish Black's impertinent move knight b4.
Very good.
I'm going to put the knight right back on d5 and go for the ideal setup. And if I have time to play b6 and bishop b7, I will be sitting very pretty.
Interesting. Okay. Okay, well, in the interest of making b6 less attractive, I wonder if I can play knight e5 before I play queen to d3. Queen to d3 is sort of more direct. Let's try this anyway.
Yeah, I like knight e5. I think that's probably the best move. b6 is right out, allowing this. We've talked about how that wins a piece already. And queen d3 also probably good enough. I might be able to play h6 at some moment and hang out without getting mated, but that's not really my dream in the position. So I'm going to play bishop d7 and try and develop my bishop this way.
Okay. It does not seem... Ooh. Do we have some ideas like queen f3 here? Is this what we talked about? That looks optically pretty good. Man, okay, well, sure.
Yeah, for what it's worth, I don't think we actually talked about this exact position.
Fair enough.
But that does look like a pretty good and normal move.
Yeah.
All right.
Queen d3 probably also reasonable, but this seems to give my light squared bishop a little more scope to come out.
Yeah, I agree. And you're threatening things like knight d5 already, where after, for example, queen h3, I would have some problems to solve. So I am going to play bishop c6, going for the principle that if I get a pawn on c6, it's usually a better pawn than this pawn on d4.
Yeah, that makes sense. Certainly d5 becomes real hard to play. This does let me grab the bishop pair. I'm wondering if it's worth it. It feels like it probably can't be that bad. Also, not losing to a series of discoveries makes sense, so I think I'll take that.
Yeah, I also think that the position is good for white. I think white has a clear edge now. Even though you have that Isolani, that you have good light square control, the bishop pair, I have my own isolated pawn I have to deal with. So I think that combines to say that white has a real edge.
Desperately want to develop my light squared bishop, but I don't see anything useful to do with it yet. I think I'm actually going to try this move instead.
Oh, interesting. I had not considered that.
Yeah, well, that's usually not a good sign. With other players, it is.
All right, so John's idea is that after, after knight takes e4, his bishop is not going to be hanging because he's immediately threatening mate. And I think that's a good enough reason to go for this. At the same time, I might be willing to take on e4 because it's trading off some pieces and I have a little bit of a cramped position.
Yeah, that does make sense. That does make sense.
Yeah, all right. I am going to take it. So I will go for this line that you are inviting me to try. Now, again, knight f6 would be a large mistake. That is going to hang a piece. So I'll play g6.
Yeah, also important to note that sometimes f5 can be a defensive idea in these. Not a great one, but, maybe if it won a piece, it would be worth it. But instead, of course, it hangs the e-pawn with check and therefore can't be considered.
Right.
Okay, so, looking at this more deeply now, I see your point. Because I was thinking that this bishop h6 move was really good, but I'm starting to realize that you have some ways to extract it that are pretty simple.
Yeah, and I do have to think about how I want to play, but I think I'm going to play this rook e8 move and not spend too much time thinking about it.
Okay. Yeah, so already feeling a little bit less good. I wonder, though, that's sort of interesting. Okay, so I don't like this idea of bishop g5. I feel like this idea of bishop g5 is the thing that I missed, and that makes me really unhappy. I can prevent it. I'm not sure that I should. It might be a case of throwing a good position, throwing good moves after bad, I guess, to try and borrow from a poker expression. I could also withdraw the bishop, but I don't have a great place to put it after bishop g5 either. What the hey? Let's try this invariably bad idea.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. I thought you'd look down on it. Dark Harden. That's what it is. Dark Harden. Yes, I must remember.
All right, so I am considering c5, which would trade off these pawns and potentially let my bishop come to life. Of course, the downside concretely is that you're going to have a 2-on-1. I'm thinking about knight f6, which would threaten knight to g4 with a pretty nice position for black if I can get that. Yeah, I don't think a dark square bishop trade was bad for white either if he takes.
Okay, maybe too worried about that. Yeah, I thought probably f4 was an overreaction, but I don't know. I also learn best by trying things, and sometimes I just feel like I would rather see what's going on with my move than stay away from something. I'll know much more definitively that it's bad next time.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm going for a pretty typical rearrangement of bringing the knight to f5.
Yeah, that all makes sense.
To gang up on the d4 square.
Yeah, no, this all makes a lot of sense. Okay, so this is interesting now. So trying to develop my bishop runs into knight b4, which is pretty annoying. Yeah, and I see how f4 completely shuts me out of coming back, and now I almost want to trade it off myself. So funny. Definitely overestimated the attacking chances. Okay. Time to start groveling.
I don't think you're worse. I think if you connect your rooks and start to play on the c file, you're still doing quite well.
Yeah, I don't want to lose the light squared bishop in order to do that, though.
How are you worried about losing it? Like bishop d3, knight b4?
Yeah.
I think you probably have bishop c4 there. And I don't know if it quite works because I can take on d4, but I don't even think giving up the d4 pawn is so bad.
Yeah, there's your... We know how you feel about the...
But if you're really worried about it, you can always flick an a3.
I think that's what I have to do, because I think after all of that, you maybe have knight c2 at the end of those lines.
Yes, if I trade off the queens... And
it's all with check,
yes,
right? It's all with check, and then I have to move, and yeah, yep. I don't think so. I don't think so, Tim. Now that is a show that has not been referenced in a while.
All right, I'm going to go for knight f5 right away. I don't think there's any reason to wait.
Okay. It's nice of someone to notice, Richie, what I put myself through for the benefit of other people's education. Thank you. Richie, you come back anytime. We need more people like him. Okay, well, this is just not my fave.
John's deep in thought.
I am. All right. Rook d1, knight f5, bishop g5. Can you take is my question. It actually feels like, well, I guess if you take, then I have just enough time to move my bishop so that I don't die. Okay, fine.
Okay. I think that makes a lot of sense, permanently defending this so you don't have to worry about it. And now I'm going to go for this knight d5 idea, hitting the bishop. Knight f5. God, I am terrible at squares.
Okay, well, I'm pretty sure I know what to play on this turn.
Yeah, and you know what? I'm going to take it.
I thought you might because you are... can't even muster a good insult. Yeah, this is a bummer. Would strongly prefer that you not trade the queens off, but alternatives seem real bad too. Yeah, I think this is one of those moments where I just have to accept that I need to finish my development.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that it's a pretty nice position for black now, and honestly, I think we could stop anytime because I think we've gotten past the opening.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Well, if you just want to offer me a draw, that's fine. Wow, he did it! Oh, what a gent. Oh, I'll resign. I don't feel right about it.
White declines. White resigns. All right. Well, let's add this to our study.
Better player and the bigger man, but I couldn't accept.
All right. Yeah, let's take a look at this position. We have names on this study, so we have to switch to this one. There we go. All right. Oops, that was not the right button. Okay, we don't have any guests, so it's just us. We are not doing the roundup.
Yeah, bringing it back soon.
Okay,
Alex Ho's name spotted.
Yeah, Nick, really good observation. I think F4 was a little bit over-eager, and I also think that potentially Queen F3 maybe not the right way to play that. But let's
Queen F3 no good?
I don't know. I liked Queen D3 first a little bit, but we'll look at that in a moment. So I think the first 10 moves were perfect. This is exactly what we had talked about. And now we were talking about A3 is the main move, but Bishop G5 is kind of the move that I've decided on after time because I think it's a little bit off the beaten path and we're putting the bishop on the most natural square. Are you still on our study or do you...
yeah, excuse me. Hang on. I think because I clicked over to the game.
Okay. Okay,
yes,
perfect. You found it.
Yep.
All right. So let's... oops, I won't scroll. All right. So after knight b4, that's a little bit unusual. It is the second most common move, but b6 is probably better. And we very briefly said knight b4, bishop b1 is a good position for white. And the engine justifies that. It's plus 0.7.
Great. Yeah, that's interesting. That's worth noting because it occurs to me that although I described the position as open, it's really semi-open at best. You know, it's not some e4, e5 game where we've traded all the center pawns. So you still should have some time for maneuvers like this.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's a good observation. And then the other consideration is knight e5. So knight e5, the justification is if the knight is not stopping us from coming to e5, well, we should come to e5 as expediently as possible. I'm trying to add the stuff back so that everybody can see the engine evaluation, because I do think that it's important to look at the engine evaluation as we're going through these lines. All right, there we go. Okay, so after bishop e1, I put the knight right on d5, and I liked knight e5 a lot. I think that's a very normal-looking move, although it does look like queen d3 has been played 3 times, and a3 has been played once as well. So what do you think about queen d3 right away? I think it forces g6, so I think black would have to respond with g6 to shut down these mating ideas.
Yeah, I definitely considered it. I think that I was just trying to be honest, I think I was never playing this game with a serious intent of winning it so much as exploring ideas and trying to do things that are outside of what I might normally do. Now, in the case of f4, you know, yeah, that would be the kind of thing that I would always want to do and restrain myself from doing in a serious game. But in this case, queen d3 is just such an obvious idea. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense? It's like, that doesn't mean it's bad, but I just had an air of, okay, let's do some other things first because I know what is going to happen. You know, I'll play queen g3, he'll play g6. I don't know. I guess I just wanted to explore some things that I might not have originally thought of and push myself to think outside the box, which I think is useful at this learning stage. But yeah, definitely not. There's nothing wrong with the obvious idea when you're actually playing and competing. But that's the explanation I have for you.
Yeah, that's a pretty good way to put it. And I think that looking at the engine, it looks like knight d7 is actually an interesting idea here. My engine's having all sorts of problems. I'm going to try and reload and see if that makes a difference. Yeah, after knight d7, the idea would be black is trying to trade off a bunch of pieces, but I really am suspicious of knight d7. Anytime we're letting the queen come and threaten mate, I think that that's giving too much to white. So I prefer my bishop d7 move, even if it does allow white to get the bishop pair very quickly.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So after knight e5, bishop d7, it looks like queen d3 would have been a edge for white. I think that forces g6 to not get mated. And probably queen f3, maybe bishop h6. We were looking at ideas that were very similar to this earlier, even though I don't know that that this is an exact position that we've looked at. But does this look somewhat familiar to you from before?
Yeah, a little bit, and I plan on looking at it a little more later, for sure. I think that I pick up more.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, just I think I pick up more than I may have said. You know, I often find that I have a certain feeling for the right move later, and it turns out that that happened several times where you said, yeah, that's what we went over. You know, but yeah, it was just the process of checking our viewers and trying to sort of do what I can to contribute that I was not always able to fully concentrate on everything.
Yeah, that's a fair point. Let me move that slightly so that you can see the third line of the engine too. All right, so just to bring it back to a concrete line that we looked at before, so everybody remember this position. The line that we were looking at before was actually in the bishop f6 line, if I can do this correctly. So after bishop e6, bishop e4, knight e7. Did I get the move order right? I think I got the move order wrong. But just to show the line, because I'm not going to try and get it exactly right.
Yeah.
It was this bishop e4, knight e7, and now we had queen d3, g6, and h4. And h4 is a virtual novelty, and the idea here is actually I missed knight e5, didn't I? Knight e5 first here, knight e5, bishop e7. Now this, yeah, there we go. And this is actually very, very similar. After bishop takes, we have both queen to f3 and bishop g5, both of which are pretty nice to play.
Yeah, this all rings very much familiar.
So not quite the same, but pretty similar.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think queen d3 is perfectly fine, and I would go for it in future. Like I said, perhaps just trying to be a bit too clever. And
yeah.
Although knight e5 can't be that bad. Obviously.
No, I like knight e5. I think I would probably play knight e5 over queen d3 on move 13. It's the move 14 when queen f3. I think queen d3 is much nicer.
Yes.
All right, so just to briefly close out the game, I think after bishop c6, white is still doing okay if you play something like queen h3 and just go for broke. I almost certainly have to play g6, and now this is a way you could attack by playing something like bishop h6.
Right, yep, driving away from the defensive f7.
Exactly.
Yep. And I have the sack right now.
Yep, you have this
very nice shot. Ah! Yeah, there's just no reason. There's just no reason to get rid of that knight. He's too gorgeous.
Yes, exactly. Although, again, bishop h6 does run into some counterattacking ideas. so it's not so clear. But this is kind of what white is worried about, or black is worried about in the Panov. Tricks on e6, hanging pieces on e7, and it gets dangerous in a lot of lines.
Yeah. Yeah, right. But that being said, if I'm playing anybody who's, frankly lower rated than you, I would feel comfortable, being up the exchange in a pawn. I'll take that. I recognize fully that the being down the exchange with an extra pawn is not so bad and very playable, but I'd still rather be the guy with the extra material.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that that's a good approach. I think that it's very hard to sacrifice an exchange for good compensation. Usually you're losing an exchange and giving endgame odds to your opponent, which is a little bit much in most games.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a little bit hard for John and I to play the position, not the opponent, just because we've played so many times. But I think that against other people, we definitely do try and play the position and just find the best move.
Yeah, I don't worry too much about rating, to be honest. I have an ego to beat just about anybody, but Andrew can be more difficult sometimes for me. When you've played somebody for how many years now?
Oh god, 16, 17, 18. It's been a while.
Yeah, it's been a long time and many, many, many games. So I don't know. It definitely affects how I play. Sometime I would love to look at that first game that we played in the Scandinavian, actually, because I think just as a psychological investigation of that exact point of how you can get in your own head and cost yourself opportunities, it's one that stays with me a lot. And then there's some really nice endgame technique by you to
in which no one? In
the very first one at Metro West, this 2019.
I see. Okay.
Yeah, when you decided to play the Scandinavian.
Yes. Yep.
Yeah.
I've deleted that game. We have no record of it. We can't possibly look at it.
Oh, that's so weird because I have it a lot of different places. You still won.
I did, but barely.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's still the best. Scare I've given Andrew in quite a while, I think, in a serious game. Anyway, back to this. So this looks like we're rolling more or less straight zeros, maybe a tiny advantage for black.
Yeah, I would consider this to be an advantage for black because of the structure. White's compensation is dynamic in that you have the bishop pair, and after a move like bishop c2 to b3, you have some attacking ideas on f7. But the fact that everything other than bishop c2 is minus 0.6, minus 0.7, I think that means if you don't play very concretely and very accurately here, it's a nice long-term structure for black. And I think that this is one of the traps you can fall into if you use the engine too much. So before I was saying it's important to always analyze with the engine, but I think it's equally important to not only rely on the engine. You have to look at the entire position and the ideas as much as anything else.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I will also say that, the fact that White's massive sacrifices and sort of big attacking ideas seem to be dwindling feels like already a loss. Not that the game is lost, but certainly, as you were mentioning when we wrapped this game up, that we were past the opening and White has not achieved his aims. So that's already enough to be kind of pessimistic about it. Black is starting to have momentum. If we were looking at it from a football standpoint.
Yeah, yep.
Anyway, yeah, F4 is just straight bad. I mean, I don't know. I sometimes do insane things that I would yell at my students for doing. It's weakening. It feels like these queen b6 even, just taking over that diagonal already feels like such an indicator. c5 right away was probably also very strong.
That's actually an interesting moment. I think c5 gives away a lot of my advantage. Even though I get this check, I think that all of a sudden it's going to be hard to win this endgame. You have the bishop pair. My majority is less active than yours. The flip side is that I mean, white has some real concrete threats that are hard to deal with.
Question from Richie whether the Panov or the advance gives white longer term advantage.
Yeah, let's come back to that in 1 second because let's finish this game first and then we can talk about that because I have a lot to say about that. So
oh boy,
that was why I didn't go for c5. I think it gives away too much of an edge, and I'd rather keep the weak d4 pawn as opposed to trading it off. Sure. I know I mentioned that very briefly, that I think that when you compare these isolated pawns, the c6 pawn still lets you control the d5 square, so the d5 square is more important than winning the d4 pawn, and it's more important to win the pawn outright than to trade it off.
That makes perfect sense. Yes, as soon as you mentioned that, trading off the d4 pawn seems to help me an awful lot for no good reason. Yep.
Yeah. It does look like I could have played queen b6 and forked these pawns, but I'm quite content to continue with my plan. In a slower game, I probably would have played queen b6 and tried to figure out if there are any downsides to it. And of course, after I win this g pawn, I think I'm sitting very pretty. I think it's very hard for you to survive now.
Yeah. Yep. I think I'm lost.
Yeah, I agree. I think queen e3 is a little bit of a bailout, but I think that we had already talked about agreeing to a draw, and I just wanted to demonstrate that it's a pawn up for black, and it's going to be a pretty easy position to play with the knight on d5.
Yeah. Yeah, your minor piece is better than mine. You're up a pawn. Your rooks are fine. Yeah, I'd be lucky to escape with a draw here, I think. Honestly. Yeah, I think, no, but that's really interesting, and I learned a lot from that. Again, that example, I think what I liked especially was, honestly, how you just, you dealt me a lesson with that f4 move what I was talking about, right? That the more experienced player doesn't necessarily have to do anything immediately and concretely to exploit the f4 move. You just make it the awkward move that it is.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
You know, and that's the sort of thing that I continually let happen and need to cure myself of. Now, maybe doing it that time actually is better for it, but yeah, I have a tendency to try and make something like that work and pay the price.
Yeah. All right. So I just want to kind of wrap up by circling back to that point that Richie brought up. I think that, and this kind of ties it all back together because this was how we started. I think there are really only 5 real defenses for black that are well regarded against e4. And that's going to be e5, c6, e6, so the Caro on the French, the Sicilian, and depending on the day, I'll include something like the Philidor in there, although I don't really believe in the Philidor. But certainly not something like the modern. I think that gives white too much of a free hand in the center. The Alekhine, same thing. We're letting the e5 pawn come forward right away and conceding the center. So I think that it is one of the real openings that you must be prepared for as white if you're playing e4. To that end, I think that the only lines that promise an advantage for white are the advanced variation and maybe the Panov, although I don't think the Panov with best play is anything more than equality. I think that the main line has been worked out too far to really promise an edge for white. So I think if you're going to play the Caro as white, go for the advanced or the Panov. And I think that other lines, like the 2 knights, are really just not offering enough to white. I think it's too easy for black to equalize quickly. I will mention for completeness that any sort of King's Indian attack is also a reasonable approach. It's a nice shortcut again. You don't have to memorize as many openings, and this works against the French and the Caro, as well as some other sidelines.
You know, Ty, the King's Indian attack is not something that Andrew and I would make fun of.
That's probably true.
We'll find a way.
Yeah, so the point is, though, that instead of taking on d5, if you play e5, if you play this advanced stuff, I like the h4 lines. I think that this is a line that was first popularized by Tal in his World Championship match. Richie is talking about the bayonet attack with g4, And this is very, very double-edged. You can go for these lines where the bishop is just about trapped, but we have more or less abandoned the kingside structure. So it's super unclear. Here, I think queen d6 is already close to equality for black. But the bayonet attack is a ton of fun for white, and I would probably recommend playing bishop d7 so you don't have to worry about some of the sharpest stuff.
Yeah, I saw a really nice Anand game where he played bishop d7 and then played for a very fast c5.
Was
And
that against Shirov, this one? From 2011.
Yeah, that's the one. Yeah, that's it's very precise, and you'd have to know what you were doing, but it seems like black holds it together, even though the center collapses. The tactics along the long diagonal are enough to hold.
Yeah, exactly. The idea is to play c5, bishop c6, and now because this pawn has moved from g2, you have some tricks on this diagonal.
Yeah.
Mark Esserman wrote a tongue-in-cheek blog post for the U.S. Chess League probably 7 years ago on just this line. So if you were curious, you could look that up later. But yeah, I think that in the advance, the short variation is very strong with bishop e2. The lines with a very quick c4 are strong as well. Either c4 right away and then filling in behind it with knight c3 and knight f3. The bishop d3 stuff is not so bad here. This line is okay for white. You can either take with the queen or you can play c takes a lot of the time, which looks ridiculous, but it's not. This is something that is a real line. So I think there are a ton of ways you can play as white. I do like the tall variation. It lets you have all of these tricks. Basically, every move other than h5 is losing right away, so it's very hard to play precisely. h6 lets you transpose into an extremely nice variation of the bayonet attack. This is already completely winning for white. But I think that it's just picking what you like. I think all of these lines are good enough for white, and they can give you an advantage, but against a very well-prepared opponent, really chess is a draw for move one, so it's very hard to get something other than a complicated equal position.
Yeah. I mean, if somebody's putting in just as much work as Andrew is, especially, that's a good example. That there's only so much you can hope for.
Yeah. Richie, I'm not sure it's an improved variation of the bayonet, but it's different. So I think it's a way to complicate the game. You can basically play this position as a starting point and then put some piece on g5, either the bishop or the knight, and play that way. I think there are a couple of Shanklin's games in this variation for both colors. White can play a very quick c4 and play this position. This is an annoying position for black. But it's just kind of a try them out, see which one you like the best, and that's kind of what I've done over the years, and I've decided that the Panov suits my style the most.
Yeah.
I also think for your development, playing at least one opening that leads directly into an IQP is very, very useful.
Yeah, and I've really enjoyed at a different level. I've really enjoyed the opportunity to understand the position. I'm playing at a level where a lot of my opponents are less theoretically prepared than I am, or at least, at worst, equally. And I find that just having a basic understanding of the plans and these ideas of playing for d5 and the attack gives me something. As I said earlier, I've had games against 2100s where they played this h6 move way too early in these IQP positions and gave me a lot of wonderful kingside attacking chances. So I've just found that it's a really good way to get good practical advantages over players of all levels, as long as they're below the master level.
Yeah, that's fair.
Ty. Stop making losing your brand, Ty. It doesn't suit you, and it's not going to help you win games. Richie, you should definitely... we would love to keep you posted on the tournament that we are planning to do, the third Acceptable Chess tournament that will be coming up in January. If you plan to stick around, which I guess you do since you subbed, which thank you again. Yeah, we're definitely looking to get some more strong players into the field. Andrew and I are going to be playing, and I already have one more master on the hook to join as well. So it should be some good competitive fun. And we do a lot of extra features around the tournament, including the roundup, which is definitely our main event still. Although this was awesome. And thank you, Andrew, again for letting us see inside your brain so much.
My pleasure.
Evening. I think I love playing the themed blitz and rapid matches as well. You know, it gives us chances to explore openings from both sides. So we'll do some more of that. But long story short, I think I will wrap things up by just saying we will be back on Thursday. I think Tuesdays and Thursdays are some nights that we are planning to keep going with other nights as we can get it in and frankly feel like it. So, but Tuesdays and Thursdays I think you can count on. So please do come back Thursday night at 8:30, where we'll be doing some more stuff like this and getting into it with all of you. But until then, I am your host, John Harden. This is my friend and national master, Andrew Hoy, and we both thank you for watching Acceptable Chess.